Was to be a part of these new lands that were created. In fact, it says specifically in there that the continuation of the opportunity for subsistence uses by rural residents of Alaska, including both native and non-native on the public land, is essential to natives' physical, economic, traditional, and cultural existence, and to the non-natives' physical, economic, traditional, and social existence. And subsistence is defined as the customary and traditional use by rural residents of wild renewable resources for direct personal or family consumption, for barter or sharing, for personal or family consumption, and for customary trade. I was introduced to this customary lifestyle when I moved in 1963 to Nikolai, Alaska in the Upper Kuskokwim. And Nikolai is one of the resident communities, along with Talida, its neighboring community, in Denali Park. In the additions, they were listed as resident communities. And I spent about 8 years in Nikolai. But I want to begin by talking about my introduction to that customary lifestyle. In '63, I moved with my family to Medford, which wasn't even in Nikolai. How did that come about? Well, I visited Nikolai in March of that year and found out that as soon as school was out, everybody went to fish camp at Medford. So if we'd have gone into Nikolai in May when we moved to the area, there would have been 0 people there. And so we went to Medford and spent the summer there. Everybody was scattered along the river there in fish camp, putting up the fish they needed for the winter for their dog teams, because everybody was using dogs at that time. I made it known that I needed a place to live in Nikolai, so I was contacted by one of the members of the community there that had built a cabin in Nikolai, but he was living in Talida. And he had built a cabin in anticipation of coming there in a couple of years for his children to go to school in Nikolai. But he wasn't going to need the cabin. What he needed that summer was an outboard motor. And there was a new outboard motor in the trading post in Medford. So I ended up buying an outboard motor and swapping it for a cabin in Nikolai. And then I acquired a small boat, and I had a small motor myself. And he helped me move up there with a boat that he borrowed from his father-in-law, Carl Susui, the chief of Talida. So I ended up moving up in late August to Nikolai. And then one of my neighbors there came up, moved his family up so they could go to school. He was still working down in McGrath. He needed somebody to take care of the fish wheel to bring the fish in so his family could cut them, because he was downriver with his boat. So he, in exchange for some of the fish, I started checking the fish wheel for the first time. And I'd come in with a tub of whitefish every day, sometimes 2 tubs, and about 40 chum salmon. And I got a part of them to cut. And I didn't know about cutting and drying fish except what I'd seen that summer. So he says, well, I'll come and show you. And I said, no, my wife's going to do that. And he was a little surprised that this Gusik woman is going to cut fish, but she'd already agreed to do that. So he said, well, my wife will come. So she showed my wife how to cut fish. And so I took care of the wheel, brought in the fish, and they started putting them up. That was what we needed to feed the dog that winter. Then about mid-September, when it started getting cool, I mentioned that as well as giving me the cabin, he threw 2 dogs in. John Dennis there, he threw into the mix there that he had. And so I had 2 dogs. Well, there was another elderly man I got to know there. He had 1 dog. So he loaned me that dog for the winter. He said, here, this was this. Well, I found out later that was handy for him because I fed the dog all winter. Not only that, but his son would come and borrow that dog plus my 2 to go haul wood for him and for himself. So that's the way things worked in the community, with an awful lot of cooperation. That same individual that loaned me the 1 dog didn't have a boat or a motor, but he wanted to go moose hunting that fall. One man in the village had built a new boat, 30-foot boat, out of whipsawed lumber that summer. And, but he didn't have a motor big enough to push that up the river, and he needed a motor. Well, I had a motor as well as the one that I purchased, so this older gentleman got together with the 2 of us and said, let's go hunting. And so he put me together with the other fellow, and I provided part of the gas, and they provided part of the gas, and we took off and went up to the North Fork hunting moose. We hunted for 2 days and didn't see anything. And then we stopped at a lake, and there was a bear down at the end of the lake on a gut pile where a moose had been killed earlier. They knew about this, and we were checking lakes all the way up, watching the sandbars and so on, but 2 days and nothing. And so then the teenage son of the man who had the boat, he shot the bear. And then after that, the older fellow says, well, that's why we didn't see any moose, he said, for 2 days, because I've been thinking about bear. Well, sure enough, the next day we saw a moose on the barn. We shot our first moose. We went up a little further and camped at another lake. One of the young boys paddled in the lake in the coon. We got a second moose. We came back to the village. I ended up with half a moose. The elderly gentleman got half a moose, and the one who had the boat and the teenage sons, he ended up with a full moose. So, and I hadn't shot either of the moose, but I ended up with half a moose. Then later that winter, as soon as the snow was on the ground, 1st of November and so on, they started trapping. And I used my 3 dogs to go out to the Alaska range with them, and they hunted out at the Alaska. It's about 90 miles from Nikolai out there. So I was introduced to traveling cross-country, winter camping, and all of that. They hunted at the hills for a few days so the traps would work, and then they go back to the village. And that pattern was repeated through the winter, going out to the hills and then spending about a week in the village, taking care of the family, cutting wood and so on, and then going out and checking them again. And that meat would be brought back. Later on in December, while they were out at the hills, they also would get a couple sheep, and they'd bring those back. Well, the sheep season wasn't on then, but that was their traditional time of getting sheep. And then that sheep would be shared with the whole village at the potlatch on December, when they got together for Christmas activity and so on. So everybody got a part of that sheep that came back from the hills. Long towards spring, we're running out of meat. Also, there was no electricity in the village, so we had to wait for cold weather before we could harvest our moose, because what you couldn't eat right away, you had to hang outside, and then you brought it in and thawed it as you needed it to get meat off of it that winter. If there's any left in the spring, you cut and dried that and used it for dry meat to see you into the summer. And but they get tired of eating that leftover meat, or they're out of meat, so somebody would go out in the spring and they'd get a moose. And then again, that was shared with the whole village, so everybody got a meal, ourselves included. So they just included us in their life at that time. And then, of course, as soon as school was out, everybody was in the boats, boom, off to fish camp again. So that was a pattern that they'd been following for a long time, with the summer fishing, berry gathering in the fall, moose hunting in the fall, running trap lines in the fall, and then back. And young people were involved in those activities, like I mentioned, the hunting. The young man, it was the first bear that he'd shot. That was an interesting experience, because after the bear had been shot, they're standing here, one of the elder is talking to the bear. And then the first thing they did is they blinded the bear before they cut it up or skinned it. And the head was taken off, and they lopped off a spruce tree nearby, and they left the head there. But the meat was taken back to the village for consumption. Well, I didn't know enough of the language to know what was going on, but actually he was apologizing to the bear that, sorry, but we needed some meat, that's why we shot you, and so on. So that was a polite thing to do. Also, when they go out hunting like that in the fall, they don't say, I'm going to go hunting moose. They say, I'm going to go look around, because you don't know what you're going to see. There has to be that cooperation from the animals there, and you see what's there. The bear was the first thing that provided. We needed meat, so we shot the bear. Then we were able to get a couple moose. They came along. And young people were along. One of them was driving the boat because he was learning to read the river and the channels at the time. Another young teenager was there, paddled in the lake with a canoe, and got the second moose back in the lake out of a canoe. And then we emptied the boat out, put it in the lake, went up and brought the whole moose back, and then carried it out to the river and so on. So that was the pattern that went on then. And as you could see, there's a lot of cooperation involved in that. There's the learning of young people. There is a sharing of resources, boat and motors and equipment and so on, the sharing of the meat and so on. And I quickly became aware that the state management system doesn't really accommodate that. What about that extra moose in the spring? That's out of season there. Or those sheep that are taken, that's out of season there. But at that time, there wasn't close enforcement, and they were able to follow that traditional pattern of life. And as Terry Chapin mentioned on the first day, the interior Athabascans are very adaptive. They've adapted to a lot of change. And they can do that when they have control of access to the resources. But now the control of access has been taken over by the various management systems, the state or the entities, the Federal Subsistence Board on those state lands. And that's what's causing some of the problems, because there's conflicts with them. As it mentioned in the legislation, there's supposed to be a continuation of the opportunity for subsistence. Well, that has been reduced down to a 2-week hunting season, let's say, in the fall. That's your opportunity. So you've got to go out then, whether the animals are ready, the weather is ready or what, you've got to go out then during that time. When that time's up, your opportunity's up, whether you've got the meat you need or not. And the reason I came to this conference is I was concerned about the widely fluctuating weather we've had over the last few years. You can't predict anymore what the weather's going to be. You used to be able to, you know what it was going to be like in the fall. You knew when it was going to start freezing, when the moose were going to start moving, when the leaves were going to fall off the trees, and all those are critical. If you can't see, example this fall, I went out the first 5 days of season. We didn't see a moose during those first 5 days. When we travel up the river, the water's high right now. What difference does that make? Well, it's easier to get around, but none of the bar is exposed. So we can't see where moose are crossing the river. It has to drop and expose bars, because then you can see the tracks and you can see, oh, the moose have crossed the river here. Maybe these lakes nearby, there's moose there. We see no sign going up. All the willows on the bars are all in leaf still. You can't see in the bars or into the woods at all. So unless the moose is standing right there in sight on the river, you're not going to see it. And even when you walk into the lakes, it's kind of hard to see. So normally, like I mentioned, going up the North Fork in the fall, they would find moose sign, they'd stop, go in and check the lake out. If there was fresh sign there, beds, then they might camp nearby and listen that evening, or hunt, or have somebody paddle in the canoe, as they mentioned. It told them where to hunt. Also, they knew where that bear had been, that moose had been killed before, where the bear was on the gut pile, because they checked with the other hunters when they came back from the village. And
you're out of time. Finish your sentence.
Man, let me get into the change. Okay, so these weather changes now have led to them asking the commissions to extend the season, because at the end of the season, as Isaac mentioned the other day here in Eagle, they may not even have an opportunity to go out. I mean, the conditions are not right. The moose aren't even moving yet, or they're not in rut yet, and so they haven't had an opportunity. So what they're doing is they're petitioning for that. What we really need is a more flexible system that will allow some of this continuation to go on and allow the teaching to go on to the young people if you're really going to support that lifestyle. And it can't be that we'll do it next year, we'll extend the season. We don't know what it's going to be like next year. Next year it may be different. It may be no water, as there is some years, and you can't get to areas that you used to get to, and so on. In the winter, freeze up is coming different now. They may not be able to travel across country. If there's a winter season, it may come on, but nobody can travel yet. It's not safe to travel. Now they're using snow machine. So these factors are being complicated by this fluctuating weather and dramatically impacting it, and you're going to see more requests from the villages, as we had a couple of years ago, to extend the season or something. But the system we have in place now can't respond very quickly. So that's where it's at. And if you ask an elder about this, you'd get a story. If you ask him what's the impact, you'd get a story like I gave you. That's why I chose to deliver it in this fashion. So when you ask the questions too, you'll have to listen to the stories they give you and read between the lines and listen very carefully, because they'll give you an answer, but it may not be in the format you're used to up here with points 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. It'll come out in a story of how it's personally impacting them, and you have to interpret that. Well, I'll have to stop.
Thank you very much.